This is Distant Replay, the podcast that goes back in time to relive all the greatest events that we witnessed in sports. From upsets, to championships, to cultural moments, we discuss it all. Coming up on today's episode.
They must make one here to extend the game. Collins driving, almost lost the handle. Chalmers for the tie. Got it for 2 seconds. Unbelievable. Dozier at midcourt for the championship. No, we're going to overtime in San Antonio.
Going back to April 7th, 2008, one of the best national championship games in college basketball history. Memphis and Kansas, two powerhouses that season, two of the best teams all year long, cruised through the NCAA tournament. Only one really tight game for either one of these two teams throughout the NCAA tournament, and they matched up in the finals. Very similar squads and a great outcome, and it is the focus of today's Distant Replay podcast. I'm Ben George. He is Mike Noto, and we go back 12 years, Mike. This is a national championship game. I think if you had to list out, at least over the last 25 years, the best games, this has to be in the top 5.
Now, yeah, this is one of the, you had the marquee coaching matchup in this one, which we'll get to here in a second, with John Calipari and Bill Self. You had rosters littered with NBA players, and you had overall what was a solid college basketball season, climaxing with this championship game.
So we'll get into all that today. We'll go through the game itself. We'll also talk about some social media, some outdated. There are some outdated things, although it's not that old. Plus, we'll talk about these coaches, rosters, all that stuff here on the podcast today. Remember, you can find us online, distantreplaypodcast.com. You'll find this game itself in its entirety. You can go back and watch it. It's a very quick watch. The commercials are cut out, so you can just go through it. Really, one of the fastest games I remember us watching so far, which was nice. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube as well. Every episode is there. So let's begin. Again, national championship game, April 7th, 2008, held inside the Alamodome. San Antonio, Texas, great venue, great game. And let's start coaches, because this was the big story in this one. You had Bill Self, John Calipari at Memphis still before he left for Kentucky. Two coaches that had been good for a while and were kind of up-and-comers. I mean, both of these had been in their program for a handful of years already. But both these were guys that were like, okay, one of these guys is going to eventually win a national championship. And finally, here they were, Mike, with the opportunity.
Yeah, these are the next guys up in line, the guys who have won a lot of games but haven't won a championship. So think like Roy Williams was for a very long time. Think about how probably Mark Few is viewed now. Guys who have racked up a lot of wins but have never won it. And there's a lot of similarities between these coaches. I mean, they both started their coaching journeys at Kansas. They went into in this broadcast. Both actually, when they were coaching at Kansas, met their wives there. So a lot of similarities between these coaches. And look, what I remember this game was the storyline was twofold. It was Calipari and Self and Derrick Rose. Those were like the two storylines heading into this game.
Yeah, Derrick Rose was the other big headliner in this one. He was just a true freshman. 1 year at Memphis, he was the story. I mean, they'd already been good for a while. It's not like this program, they'd been in the Elite Eight, the previous 2 years before this year. Then you bring him in and he kind of elevates them to that next level. And he was just a different guy. And I don't know, looking back on him now, he's had obviously kind of an up and down NBA career, but he was kind of that next guy, Mike. Like, he's going to be one of the NBA greats, right?
He was going to be next in line. He was like, you're coming off Carmelo Anthony in 2003 with a great freshman performance. And that's the kind of tournament that Rose was having heading into this game. And when you watch Derrick Rose, whether it's in this game or whether early on in his pro career, it's just one of those guys where he has just breathtaking athleticism. And you think about more of the injuries that would follow later in his NBA career and how we were sort of robbed of his prime and that athleticism. But it sticks out in this game. This is a game filled, as we're going to get to, with very, very top-flight prospects and players, and he stood out even amongst them.
Yeah, he averaged almost 15 points per game that season, nearly 5 assists, 4.5 rebounds, over a steal per game, half a block. So, I mean, he did it all for this team. It was kind of a perfect fit because they had a lot of guys that were athletic on this team, super athletic, could kind of get up and down the court, some decent shooters as well, and he was just a guy that he was able to kind of orchestrate that offense and get the ball to a bunch of different guys.
Yeah, and keep in mind those stats you just mentioned for Derrick Rose. He did all of that only playing 28 minutes per game. Yeah. So if you look at some of these like Duke teams from the past that only play like 7 or 8 guys, you'll have sometimes their minutes per game in like the 34 to 37 minute per game range, because it was twofold. They were a deep team, and they played in a conference where there wasn't a ton of competition. So there was a lot of late game blowouts where Derrick Rose and some of the other frontline players weren't in there. So it limited their minutes played, and it limited their raw statistics.
Yeah, that's a great point. And let's look at their roster a little bit and talk about their season before we focus a little bit more on Kansas in this NCAA tournament. This roster, you go back and I remember a handful of these guys, but there's a couple guys on this team that I've kind of forgot about, but seeing them again was a great reminder. I mean, obviously Chris Douglas-Roberts was kind of the next guy on this team. I mean, he was behind Rose. He was still the top scorer on this team, maybe the best total player in this team, obviously not the headliner and how the careers played out, but he was still another big name on this team. You had 4 total guys eventually go to the NBA off this roster.
Yeah, and for Memphis, that's a huge number. When you look at the history of their program, 4 guys from one team. And Chris Douglas-Roberts, you mentioned, he averaged 18 points a game, again, in only 29 minutes played per game. As a matter of fact, Ben, no one in this game as a whole for either team played more than 30 minutes per game, which is a crazy stat when you think about how good they were. Just shows how talented both rosters were. But Chris Douglas-Roberts, if you followed college basketball back then, you may not have remembered he was on this team right away, but when you say his name, you remember him right away. And, did things sort of in like a herky-jerky kind of manner, but that's what made him effective,
Yeah.
And they Packer and Nance did a great job of pointing that out throughout the game.
A couple other guys that I'd forgotten about, but remember when I went back, Robert Dozier and Joey Dorsey, the 2 big men down low. Dozier was such an athletic dude at 6'9", and these guys combined for nearly 16 rebounds a game between the 2 of them.
Yeah, Dozier and Dorsey was like the bigger like football player looking center they had. You'll remember him in 2 seconds if you go back and watch this game if you follow college ball back then. And Dozier kind of one of those guys that doesn't show up a ton in the stat sheet in terms of eye-popping points per game. But again, just the kind of guy you need on a team that, is, 38-1 heading into this game?
Yeah, he was a big presence down low and would be a big factor, I think, in this game as well. This Memphis team this year, okay, looking through it, you said 38 wins, impressive season. And, you think Memphis basketball and you think, I guess a team not in one of those power conferences necessarily, and Conference USA, still a strong basketball conference, but what I'm saying, not a ACC, Big Ten, whatever. This wasn't just the 38 wins beating up on Conference USA teams. They played some pretty strong programs this season.
Yeah, so Memphis as a whole, as a program throughout the years, has a pretty storied basketball tradition, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you're talking about the Anthony Hardaway era. You're talking about during the 70s where they actually made another title game versus UCLA. So this was more of a function of sort of the conference realignment sort of really affecting their conference play. But what Calipari did throughout the years was, like you said, make that out-of-conference schedule, beef it up a little bit so there's no doubts to how good their team is. And there was no doubts to how good they were because they played the following teams out of conference. They played Oklahoma, UConn, Cincinnati, Georgetown, Arizona, and Gonzaga. That's a really, really, really good out-of-conference schedule.
Yeah, and don't forget, Georgetown was 5th ranked this season. Arizona 17th. They played USC as well.
Yep.
And then don't forget the Tennessee game was the other big one. That was played in February. The lone loss they had that season. And if you remember that game, going back to that one was huge. Game day was there. It was played in Memphis. I mean, that was 1 versus 2 that point in the season. That was an epic.
Yeah, the Tennessee game was – when was that, Ben?
That was in February. Late February. So it's like that random out-of-conference game where it's like right in the middle of the conference season. You're like, why is Tennessee playing Memphis tonight? But it just so happened, like you mentioned, I remember that game now. I'm looking it up now. Wow. If you remember, that's when Bruce Pearl had Tennessee rolling. That's when Memphis was going with Calipari. And these 2 programs are really strong. And I think they made it a point to say, hey, let's play this game and play it in a spot where it's going to get a lot of attention. Yeah,
at the time – just think about this now. This is a 25-2 Tennessee team against a 26-1.
26-0.
26-0, sorry, Memphis team. This is the Wayne Chisholm Tennessee team.
Yeah.
For those of you who are wondering, sort of trying to piece together who was on this team. Wayne Chisholm, Tyler Smith, guys like that.
Yeah.
Wow, I had forgotten about this game, but you're right. This was at the time, a huge game.
That's one we need to put on our list too, to go back and maybe watch again, because that was right in the heart of that rivalry between those two programs. They've kind of come back a little bit since that time, but in the following years that those two programs dropped off a little bit before.
Yeah, you had the two coaches who were the marquee, were the draws there, right?
Absolutely.
Big personalities in Pearl and Calipari.
Yeah. So that's Memphis again. They come into the tournament with just one loss. They are a 1 seed. On the other side is Kansas. Kansas again. Big 12 champions. They had a good year as well. And I should mention, both these teams are top 4 preseason and basically stay in the top 4 throughout the year. I mean, these were two of the teams that were the best in the country, and there was never really any doubt. Them along with UNC and UCLA, and Tennessee was right there as well. But I think these two teams, no question how good they were. And you look at Kansas, their roster starts with Mario Chalmers, and everybody remembers him. He's the one guy, if you say, okay, Kansas National Championship game, that's the one guy you're gonna name because of the obvious how the game finishes. But again, this is like all Kansas teams where you're not going to find one huge superstar like a Derrick Rose necessarily, but you're going to find just like 5 or 6 or 7 guys that end up going to the NBA.
This is, if you follow college basketball, this is a quintessential Kansas team. And what I mean by that is you're going to know 8 or 9 names from this team because they come at you in waves. They're often the best team in the Big 12, and they have a bunch of really good players. And like you mentioned, no superstars. So I'm going to throw some of these names at you, Ben. Let me know if you remembered them before you started watching. Darrell Arthur.
He didn't come to my mind before I started watching, no.
Brandon Rush.
Yep.
Mario Chalmers.
Of course.
Sharon Collins.
Yeah, definitely.
Sasha Khan. Great name.
I'd forgotten about him.
Oh, how could you forget about
Well,
that name?
it's one of those guys, like, as soon as you see him, you're like, oh, I remember him now, yeah.
Now, after his performance against North Carolina, I know one person in your life that remembers Cole Aldrich.
Yeah, he's not a fan favorite in my household.
So Cole Aldrich, and Joe, we're just mentioning some of the names of the guys who not only went on to the NBA but played major roles in this game. But this is the kind of team that Bill Self seems to roll out year in and year out. And the question was, could this be like it is? Seems like it was every year. It is every year with Kansas still. Can this be the Kansas team that gets over the hump and win it all? And look, it's one of these things where the coaches are kind of, I don't want to say they're victims of their own success, right? They're constantly pumping out 25, 30 win teams. And it comes a point where you're like, all right, can this coach win it all? That was the question surrounding not only Bill Self heading into this game, but Calipari as well.
Yeah, and when you look at this roster too, I mean, you had your leading scorer was Brandon Rush at 13.3 points per game. I mean, nothing that's going to be, wow, this is a scoring team. Yeah, but you had 3 other guys that averaged double digits on that squad, and then Sharon Collins was right there, just under 10 points per game. So again, it's one of those situations where you had 5 scorers on this roster. Nobody's going to ever. You might have one guy take over a game, but for the most part, it's going to be pretty balanced.
Yeah, and that sort of played through in this game as well. There was different players at different times that came up big for Kansas, as we'll get to.
And you look at their schedule. You go through what they were able to do this year. Again, they played, they're going to always play a pretty good schedule throughout. You look at their schedule, though, Mike, they're non-conference. I was more impressed by looking at what Memphis did in the non-conference schedule than what Kansas did. And Kansas didn't have to play anybody, but they both played USC. USC was actually ranked at the time when Kansas played them. They played Arizona, a pretty good matchup as well. But other than that, I mean, obviously when you get into conference play, it's a much bigger deal. But, you look at their schedule overall, Memphis' schedule almost matches up with theirs.
Yeah, if you remember what the focus was for Memphis, right? They were in a totally different situation than Kansas. The knock on Memphis was, they're probably going to go undefeated in Conference USA, but do they show you enough in the non-conference to take them seriously? So that was a major, major sort of cloud around Calipari and Memphis at that point. So he made a concerted effort to really, really beef up the out-of-conference schedule. Kansas, like you mentioned, I mean, there's some games here where when they were scheduled, you probably thought, oh, okay, these teams are going to be in the mix here and be good teams. Like they do have some Power 5 schools in here, Boston College, Georgia Tech, like you mentioned, Arizona, who they played and went to overtime with, but they weren't ranked at the time. So some games that might have looked good on the schedule, but when we got actually into the season, I don't think those teams were maybe as good as Kansas had planned.
Yeah, only one ranked opponent in the preseason before they got into conference play. But it doesn't matter. We know they're legit, and they go into the tournament. Again, this tournament featured The 4-1 seeds, North Carolina, Kansas, Memphis, and UCLA, who I'd forgotten was a 1 seed that season as well. But those 4 teams, again, were very good throughout the year. And just to kind of show you how good they were, it's the first time ever, if you remember, that all 4 1 seeds made the Final Four.
Yep, all 4 1 seeds made the Final Four. All 4 1 seeds had a pretty easy time of it from what I remember in the Elite Eight outside of Kansas, who was the only close game of the tournament was when they beat Davidson and Stephen Curry. But, yeah, it's one of those times where the office pool, the person who wins it is the person who knows the least because they just picked all the 1 seeds.
Yeah, pretty much. And that's kind of how it played out. And you're right, the only true tough game in that Elite Eight round, and I think they all went double digits, but you look at that Kansas-Davidson game, which, again, that's the second game from this season we need to put on the list, but Kansas only beat Davidson by 2, and we all remember the run. I mean, Davidson with Steph Curry that year, they were the story of the tournament, but I had forgotten that was just a 2-point game, and Kansas barely even got to the Final Four. Yeah,
not only that, but the score was in like the high 50s. It was 59-57. So I think that's more surprising that a Kansas team only scored, 59 points versus Davidson, a low, like a mid-major at best, right? Maybe even a low major at that point. But that Stephen Curry story was the story of the tournament. It was Stephen Curry's coming out party, and sort of the rest is history with how his career ended up.
So we go into the game. When you watch this link over again, you kind of hop right into it. So you don't get a lot of the pregame conversation. So I think we got just about everything. But, when you look at these two teams just on paper, and they point this out early in the broadcast, which, of course, is on CBS, as it always is, you see just how balanced and even these two teams are. I mean, almost every major statistical category, points, rebounds, shooting, they're almost identical.
It's crazy how identical. So I mentioned the minutes per game, which was the first thing that stuck out to me, right? But both teams average 80 points per game. Mm-hmm. They give up 61 points per game. Their rebounding numbers, one team averaged 38 rebounds, one team averaged 40, and they both averaged 6 blocks per game. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Those are big numbers too. And now they preface it by saying, and it's right to preface this, that Kansas did play in the Big 12, a lot more competition in conference. But like we mentioned, Memphis had a very, very seriously good out-of-conference schedule.
Yeah, indeed. And you get into this game, and I kind of was curious to how these two teams would come out because, again, when you talk about Memphis probably at this time, and we know how good Kansas is year in, year out, but Memphis at this time was probably maybe the more experienced team in the tournament. And I only say that because, when Self started at Kansas, he got eliminated in the first round in 05 and 06. Now 07, the year prior, they made the Elite Eight, so they kind of turned the corner a little bit there. But this is a team that had been getting knocked out early. Here they are in the championship game against the Memphis team that was in the Elite Eight the past 2 years before this. So they had a little more experience coming in here, and you kind of tell the stage wasn't too big for them early on because they jumped out to a quick lead.
They did. Early on in the game here, you're getting you're getting a lot of the nerves out, is what I would say. First 4 minutes, kind of up and down. A little bit, maybe not the best fundamental basketball being played, but, we're seeing both teams and their talent kind of on full display early and kind of a reminder of why both these teams made it this far.
Yeah, and there weren't a ton of highlights from the first half, I didn't think, Mike. I mean, it was kind of an evenly played game. It was like that throughout. I mean, you never had one team go on this huge run and take a double-digit lead at any point. It was just kind of a back and forth, very steady throughout. Memphis got off to a quick start. Kansas battles back. Memphis did have a stretch where they didn't make any field goals for about 4 minutes, a little over 4 minutes in that first half. And it was 33-28 into the first half. Were there anything else that kind of stood out to that first half? Because for me, just as good of a game as it was, there wasn't any big moments, I didn't think, in that first half.
There's some quick notes I have on this half. Kansas, was dominating in the paint. They outscored Memphis 24-8 in the paint in the half. An awful last possession by Memphis.
Yeah.
And it's getting to the point where Billy Packer's making good points here, where they're setting too many screens for Derrick Rose. They need to kind of just get out of his way and let him operate. I thought that was an excellent point he made throughout the first half. Chris Douglas-Roberts is leading Memphis with 13 points. And yeah, like you mentioned, there's kind of like a back and forth first half. Rose only one field goal to this point, which is probably the main storyline of the half, given how great he was during the tournament. And Kansas is up by 5 heading into halftime.
Yeah, I thought that's what surprised me most about the first half, I think, was the fact that Derrick Rose, whether by design or just by Kansas being able to kind of take him out of it a little bit, he just kind of seemed, I don't know if passive is the correct word, but just it seemed like he was trying to facilitate more rather than just kind of trying to take over a little bit more at that point. Like he was kind of like, oh, let me get everybody involved here in this first half and just kind of play like we have been for a lot of the year.
I agree. I think it was a combination of that and a combination of, like I just mentioned, where he wasn't given a lot of room to operate. So I think he was forced to give up the ball in situations where maybe normally he could have turned a corner and got to the basket and either kicked the ball out or finished himself. I think it was a combination of both those that had him in the situation he was in. But even with that, they're only down by 5 points heading into halftime.
And they responded coming out of half too. Memphis, 5 quick points right out of the break. They tie it up, and you're kind of, you're settling in. Okay, here we go, back and forth. And, Derrick Rose, we pointed out, okay, didn't have a great first half. Wasn't too active offensively in the first half, at least in terms of scoring. He went 24 minutes, 24 game minutes, okay? More than a half of basketball between baskets. But when he finally hit that next basket in that second half, like it all just kind of seemed to click. And, if you watched this game and knew, okay, hey, Derrick Rose was just this high-profile recruit, NBA prospect, kind of a lock to be an NBA superstar. You watch the first half, you're like, okay, he's a good player. But that second half, you can kind of open your eyes and say, okay, this is the guy that I've heard all about.
Yeah, and what you heard about Rose heading into this game was his explosion, his explosiveness, right? 1 field goal in the first half, and before you know it, with 5 minutes left, I mean, he's got like 15 points and 8 assists.
Yeah.
And, so it's just like that. Like with a snap of a finger, he turns it on, and he goes on these little spurts by himself, and you're starting to get the feeling when you're watching this game. And I remember watching it live, like, well, we're watching another, Carmelo Anthony type performance where, a freshman's going to come in, be the best player on a team that wins a championship. Did you, one thing I have to ask you, since I know you're a huge golf guy, did you notice Nance wiggling in his Tiger Woods reference right in the middle of the second half?
What do you say? Remind me.
So basically, this is peak Jim Nance, right? So we're
a week from the Masters. Yeah.
Yeah. We're a week from the Masters. It's the Final Four. Jim Nance is like, I think you could actually tell when he's broadcasting how happy he is that not only is like NFL's done, or this college basketball season's almost done, and then I just get to go sit in Butler cabin for the next week. Like it's just peak Jim Nance. But he made a comparison between Tiger Woods and Derrick Rose, and how Calipari was giving Derrick Rose articles about Tiger Woods, and how Tiger Woods reminded Calipari of Derrick Rose. How Derrick Rose reminded Calipari of Tiger Woods, and just a whole it's kind of a manufactured storyline. But hey, look, you're getting cross promotion to another CBS event, right? And you're getting Nance talking about the Masters, so win-win.
And we're still a year away from the scandal hitting the world of golf. So Tiger was still, this superstar. Not only that, but just thought of in such high regard. So I'd missed that. I was probably writing a note down or something, but that's peak Jim Nance for sure.
You could just tell it because Packer gets quiet, first of all, because he probably doesn't know anything about golf. And Nance perks up, and he's never happier.
I love it. It's great that you noticed that. All right, so when Derrick Rose was taking over, I mean, this is, and I try to go back to, you kind of mentioned you're sitting there watching and going, okay, this is that next Carmelo moment in the NCAA tournament. And I think thinking about it, I remember sitting there watching Memphis as they kind of started to take over. Derrick Rose began taking over the game. They were just kind of doing everything, and any time that Kansas did anything positive on their end of the court, and they played okay, but there wasn't any big moments for them for a lot of the second half. You just kind of felt like Memphis is slowly pulling this away, and this is it. I mean, Calipari is on the verge of winning his first championship. Everything's kind of come together for him. They've done so much at Memphis. We're watching history be made. This is one of the greatest teams in college basketball that we've seen, with one loss and with the schedule they played. And you watched it to the moment to where they got a 7-point lead, about 5 minutes left in this half. They're continuing. I was waiting with every passing minute for them to start making mistakes, turning the ball over, missing shots. And it just seemed like everything to continue to go their way, including a Derrick Rose with a shot clock winding down, an inbounds play where he's got this fadeaway over maybe the tallest defender for Kansas. I don't remember who was on him. Like this bank three-pointer ended up turning into a two, but it's just everything was going their way. And you had to be thinking, I mean, this, and I remember thinking this, like, this is Memphis's moment. They're about to close this thing out.
Yeah, and that banked in two-pointer that you mentioned put them up 7 with 4 minutes left. And like Memphis, can't stress enough, has all the momentum at this point. They're on a 13-2 run. You know, the announcers are talking about how great of a performance Rose has had in the second half. And this is at the point when you're watching the game from our perspective now, you know, in present day, and you're like, when does this start to fall off the rails? Because it doesn't look like it's going to anytime soon. Because we get to the 2 minute 30 second mark in the second half here, and Memphis is still up 7.
Yeah.
But then one of the huge turning points of the game is Bill Self's decision to start fouling with 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. There's different schools of thought on this. He obviously, this is something he scouted before the game and probably had plans for. Look, if we're down a certain amount with a certain amount of points with a certain minutes left, we're going to start fouling, and give him credit. He stuck to his plan and started fouling with 2 minutes and 30 seconds left.
And you have to go back to that season because, you know, we talk about free throw shooting is obviously key to every game, but Memphis was a notoriously bad free throw shooting team that season. That was kind of their big question mark coming in, is could they hit enough free throws, especially when the pressure's on in crunch time. And for the most part, they had done pretty well too, Mike. It was 58-51, as you mentioned, just under 2.5 minutes left when they begin fouling there. And Memphis comes out, hits a couple free throws right at the beginning. It's a 16-4 run at this point as we get to the under 2 minutes, and it's a 9-point game, under 2 minutes, 50-41. Even with the fouling, and that's what they're doing basically every possession now, you're still thinking it's a 9-point game with only 2 minutes left. I mean, unless Kansas all of a sudden just gets hot, because they only have 51 points through this game, Mike. It's not like it's a 78-71 game and they're scoring at will. I mean, this is an offensively challenged game in a lot of stretches so far. But I think not only was the Bill Self decision to start fouling, in which they kind of alluded to through the broadcast of their free throw shooting, so we kind of saw it coming. But the other big turning point was when, right under 2 minutes, it's a 9-point game. Kansas gets a long two, in which a guy's standing on like a foot inside the 3-point line. They're like, that's the worst shot in basketball. But he hit it at a timeout. Out of the timeout, they steal the inbound and hit a three, and all of a sudden, those 5 quick points, and now it's an actual ball game, because at 7 or 9, Mike, you're still in it, but mentally, you're like, that is a lot to overcome. But when you're talking about a 4-point game, totally different story.
Yeah, if you're a Kansas fan, this is probably one of the stretches you remember, because it's what got you back in the game. Like you said, that lead goes from 9 to 4 in what seemed like the snap of a finger, led by that steal of the inbounds pass and converting the 3-point shot. And now is when Packer makes the point, to his credit, is, okay, now it's a 4-point game. Now these free throws have even more riding on them.
Yeah.
And Memphis, you got to remember, if you go back and look at Memphis' schedule this year, they played very few even close games. Never mind games like within 10 points I'm talking about. Never mind games that came down to late free throws. I mean, there might have literally only been 1 or 2 of those games the whole year for them. And, they sort of brushed off the free throw shooting as like, well, we were involved in a lot of not close games, so we didn't really take it seriously. But when we want to take it seriously, we'll hit them. And this was another major storyline for them heading into the tournament, was their outside shooting overall, but more so, less than that, was their free throw shooting.
And they were all over on the broadcast too, kind of pointing that out. And you can feel that difference too when it's 7 points and you're stepping to the line and Kansas isn't doing a whole lot offensively. It's not a lot of pressure. But when they get a 5-point run there in a matter of seconds, and now you're standing at the line up 4, and if you miss the front end of a 1-and-1 and they cut it to a 2, it's completely different.
Ben, I mean, think about it. Other than the pitcher-hitter dynamic, what other moment when you're playing athletics do you feel more alone than when you're on the free throw late in the game? And more pressure. In a team sport, think of a specific in a team sport. I can't think of a specific moment other than that.
Yeah, not really in a team sport, except maybe in soccer, if you want to count that penalty kick, like in in overtime of a game or something. But yeah, I mean,
look at you bringing up the PK. You're bringing up the PKs. That's to appease our British fans.
Have we done a soccer game on the show yet? If not, we need to put it on the list.
We haven't. We
okay.
haven't.
But yeah, I think to your credit,
limited commercial breaks in soccer. We know that.
That is true. We can get through the games pretty quickly. But yeah, and you know, not only that, I mean, it actually happens too, and that's what's so good about watching this broadcast again is because you could they were kind of lining you up for what's going to happen here, and you know, down the stretch, it wasn't. And the other part was, you know, Memphis was getting their free throw shooters to the line, or their better scores. I mean, Chris Douglas Roberts was to the free throw line. He misses a couple, or misses 3, misses the front end, then misses 2. Right. Overall, though, this final last minute was crazy. After this entire game, you know, Memphis missed 4 of the last 5 free throws. And even despite that, Mike, you know, what did Kansas do in this game to really earn that victory, or at least to get them to overtime? I mean, they weren't doing anything. They turned the ball over. I think Memphis even got an offensive rebound on a free throw to keep a possession alive. I mean, it was like, even watching it again, you're like, how does Memphis squander this opportunity?
This is like the most frustrating part if you're a Memphis fan, because it seems like tell me if I'm wrong, Ben, every game we do that involves a comeback like this one, right? You mentioned in the last 2 minutes here, maybe in the last minute and a half, they get 2 turnovers from, you know, on Kansas. It's not like Kansas is, you know, executing to the point where they take this game from Memphis. You are always waiting in these games for like that moment that, you know, where, you know, the team who comes from behind, you know, sort of puts it into high gear and takes over the game. In so many of these games, it's the team with the lead screwing it up as opposed to the team coming back who takes control. Mm-hmm. Have you noticed? It's pretty much a common theme in almost every game we do.
Yeah, it definitely is. And
this game was like, it stuck out even more so. I mean, because this game was completely in Memphis's hands to win or lose up until the last possession.
And that's what was so tough to watch and think about. You know, these fans watching this game, because I remember being a classic, but I did not remember just how in control Memphis was in this game from really about the 10-minute mark on the second half. I mean, it was obviously a close game throughout, but from that 10-minute mark on, when Derrick Rose took over, and then, you know, they kind of kept a 3-possession lead almost for a lot of that second half, and then you get to the final minutes now. You know, Derrick Rose going to the free throw line. He's got a chance to put him up 4.
Hey, before we get to that, Ben, one thing before we get to that, okay? This to me was the bad play of the game for Memphis. Right before what you're talking about, okay? You have a Memphis timeout with 44 seconds left, okay? Memphis is up 2, and they have the ball. This sequence by Chris Douglas Roberts was awful. You have out of that timeout, you have a bad shot by Chris Douglas Roberts. Now, this is after Chris Douglas Roberts missed the front end of a 1-and-1, right? We have a timeout, Douglas Roberts out of the timeout, bad shot. Memphis steals the ball on the other end, okay? Douglas Roberts gets it back on a fast break, and instead of pulling the ball out, he tries to take the ball to the rim when he doesn't have a clear lane. He gets fouled. He misses both free throws. Memphis gets the offensive rebound. They're still up 2 with 10 seconds left, and Rose goes to the free throw line.
I'm glad you detailed that, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly like when you're watching this game and going.
Is like,
you're like,
could
Memphis,
you imagine?
You're like, Memphis has done everything to give the game away, and then Kansas has done the exact same, right? I mean, and I'm glad you pointed out that fast break. It was 3-on-1, and you know, even Packer mentioned after the fact, unless you have a wide open layup where it's a guaranteed 2 points, you pull the ball out there and run the clock and make them foul you. And they were still fortunate enough, even despite that mistake, to get the offensive rebound. Still a ridiculous sequence there. But again, despite all that, you have Rose going to the line with a chance to put him up by 4. And it wouldn't completely ice it, but you'd be in much better shape with 10 seconds left. Instead, he missed the front end, hits the second one. As now we're in the double bonus. Hits the second, so they go up 3, 63-60 with 10 seconds left. And then, you know, the final sequence, and even that one, Sharon Collins is going to the floor as he's handing the ball off to Chalmers, and it's almost a turnover, but Mario gets the ball, hits kind of a difficult, very difficult 3, the shot we all remember, with just a couple seconds left to tie that game up.
Yeah, and some things I did not remember. First of all, I didn't remember this Douglas Roberts sequence I mentioned before. Like, I had no recollection of that and how awful it was. But you got to remember, in the moment when you're watching it, you're like, well, the team we thought couldn't hit free throws is blowing it from the free throw line. You know, that's what the thinking was when you were watching it. And now you get Sharon Collins with the ball going a zillion miles an hour down the court on this last possession you just outlined. He almost lost the ball.
Yeah.
Like, it was like a pass while he's falling down off to Chalmers. And Chalmers, with a shot that we all remember, like you said, hits the three, ties the game with a couple seconds left. And if you're Memphis, I don't know how it gets more devastating than this. You had multiple chances to close it out at the end of the game with your best players with the ball in their hands. Mm-hmm. And right now, Bill Self is looking like a genius going to that fouling strategy with 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. Not, because number one, because Memphis, ended up missing free throws at the end. They started off good from the line, but ended up missing free throws. But it gave Kansas, more possessions and allowed them to keep in the game.
Yeah, definitely. And this is one of the shots too that you just always remember where you were when it went in. One of those moments. Where were you when this game happened? It
would have been a Monday night. I was out somewhere watching this game. I can't remember, but I specifically was watching.
I was over at shout out Brian Larson, Mitch Hummer's place in Bristol, watching the game with a bunch of people. And this was kind of one of those moments where everybody just went nuts. I mean, just bananas, because it had been such a good game. And then to have it end like this was just absolutely insane. But it wasn't over, because we went to overtime. And, overtime, not a lot to get into, because I think Memphis kind of felt that their moment had passed them by when this thing started. And I think Cal even realized it too, because, Kansas gets a steal. Memphis wins a tip. Kansas gets a steal and a layup to start overtime. And by the way, this is their first lead since like the 8-minute mark of the second half. First lead in the ball game here in overtime for quite a while. But Cal called a timeout after that first steal and basket. And I was like, whoa, this is a weird time for a timeout. At the very start of overtime, you're down 2 points. It's not like, they'd been on this huge run and finally caught the lead. Like, this is out of an overtime break. Just a very odd time, but it kind of felt like to me like, okay, I think Cal knows this thing's getting away from him.
Yeah, and Cal knows his team, right? And he knows first and foremost, the kind of the reaction they had to what just happened at the end of regulation. So that's a hey, I know my team kind of moment, and I need to call a timeout here to get things straight.
It didn't work. Spoiler.
It did not work. It did not work. No.
Kansas, they stretched their lead to 6 points midway through overtime, and you go back to regulation, it's now an 18-3 run that Kansas is on in this game. 18-3 as we're here in overtime. And in Memphis, they had gone a stretch with no field goals in 5 minutes. I mean, nothing had gone right for Memphis, and yet here they were with still a chance. But overtime really wasn't that competitive, even to the point where they're running out the clock at the end of the game. It wasn't even a spot where you're fouling up into the last possession. It was just kind of it petered out there at the end, to be honest with you, after what we saw in that regulation. But I think Memphis kind of knew they had their chance, and that wasn't it. But Kansas claims it, and still what was an epic championship game, 75-68. Overtime officially was 12-5 in Kansas's favor, and they close it out for Bill Self's first national championship and only national champion to this point. But overall, an awesome game. And I think the two things that I'll take away from this one, I think the one main thing I'll take away from this game was the fact that I had forgotten just how poorly Memphis handled it down the stretch. And I think if you were watching one of those trackers, now that we have that show you the percentage chance of a team winning at any given point in the game, like that tracker had to be at like 95% Memphis, right?
Oh, of course. And Ben, this was did you get this feeling? I remember feeling it in the moment, and more so when we went back and rewatched it. Sometimes during these games, I don't feel the best team wins, and I don't think the best team won in this case.
I'm glad you said that, because I felt the same way. I thought Memphis was the better team. Even going back and watching this again and kind of seeing what both teams have done, even knowing how the personnel played. Sure, more NBA players than that Kansas roster, but I think overall, and both these teams deservedly were in the spot and had great seasons. But yeah, to me, if you watch, and we can't do this, but if you watch 39 minutes of that game, you think Kansas is the best team in the country that year.
Yeah, exactly. And you mean Memphis, but
yeah, Memphis, yeah.
Yeah, but I know exactly what you're saying, but it's just Give Kansas credit though. They went and they took Chalmers needed to hit that shot for this all to work. They got the benefit of the missed free throws, like we mentioned, but they went out and took it. Bill Self gets the monkey off his back. Now, hey Ben, going back to that Chalmers shot. Okay,
Yeah.
Let's say there was a host of game-winning shots in big moments in the 80s, right? You had Jordan's for North Carolina. You had the NC State one. You had Keith Smart for Indiana against Syracuse. But let's say since 1990, we'll call it the Ben and Mike era of college basketball. There's 3 shots that stick out at the end of these tournament games, right? I have Leitner's shot. I have this shot by Chalmers and the shot for Villanova against North Carolina. Am I missing it?
And Leitner's wasn't even a championship game.
It wasn't. No, it's NCAA tournament shots.
Yeah.
So were those three the Holy Trinity, if you will?
Man, I'd have to really dig into it to see. But, I mean, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that tops those 3.
I mean, you have Bryce Drew, right? But that was an early round game.
I mean, yeah, there's a ton of buzzer beaters.
Malcolm Mackey for Georgia Tech. I remember hit a shot at the buzzer. I could get really corny and name a lot of them. But big moment shots. I mean, those 3 kind of stick out to me.
Yeah, and I think championship game wise, I mean, even though, and the crazy thing is the Chalmers one wasn't to win it either. That's probably the biggest shot I can remember that wasn't to win a game. The only other big shot I can remember that, again, didn't win the game was Butler's chance to hit that halftime shot against Duke in that game. That's the other one I think of, but that's for a different reason. But still, one of those shots is like, oh man, that changed. Gordon
Hayward's gone on to be like an NBA All-Star.
Yeah,
and that's still whenever I see him, that's all I think about.
Yep. But yeah, to your point, I think those are. I would say those are maybe not the 3, but those are definitely 3 of the 5. I have to dig into that a little bit more to really kind of figure out in the Ben and Mike era. Yeah, I mean, you think about the buzzer beaters, there's so many throughout the tournament that you can go back to and think about. But those are definitely
because the games are even like the early round games. There's so much focus on them that you remember all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then for those who have not listened, we did do an entire episode on the Leitner shot, the Kentucky Duke Elite Eight.
Yeah, great game.
So go back and check that out if you haven't.
Yeah, and I think that Villanova North Carolina game will be on our list at some point. It's a little bit newer, so hadn't gone back to it yet. But I mean, that sequence between both of those, Marcus Page, right before that, who we always don't even think about now, was a ridiculous shot. But yeah, great question, Mike. Great question. You stumped me. If you have a thought on that, leave us a comment or hit us up on Twitter or Instagram. So since this game, obviously Kansas with Bill Self, disappointing. I would say is kind of the way to describe it. He's been a runner-up one other time, but only 2 Final Four appearances since this championship game.
Yeah, if you look at Kansas's history and take away this Lionel Chalmers. Lionel Chalmers is Mario Chalmers' cousin who played for Xavier. You probably didn't know that. I was trying not to call him Lionel Chalmers the entire podcast, but now it happens. But if you take away this Mario Chalmers shot, right, from the Danny Manning moment on, right, Kansas from a national perspective as far as winning championships and winning games they shouldn't. I mean, it's filled with very disappointing moments and seasons because they always have really good players. They're always dominate the Big 12, and they're always a high seed.
Yeah.
So this shot by Chalmers bailed out Kansas as a whole, and most notably Bill Self. Imagine if all these years later he still hadn't won one.
And that's why when we go back to that Davidson game, I think when we actually watch that one again, I want to see how close that was because they survived that one by 2 points, and that changes everything too if they lose that game. But yeah, I mean, you think of, and Kansas fans will obviously defend Self, and I think he's obviously earned that spot and everything that he's accomplished. But yeah, I mean, there's got to be some level of disappointment for winning. I mean, they were from 04-05 season up until the 18-19 season when they finished third in the Big 12. They were first or tied for first in that conference every single year between 04 and 2018. I mean, and to
that's a stat.
And to not get anywhere with that.
And this is more. I don't know if it's more. I look at it as less an indictment on Bill Self and Kansas, or of look how much you have to thread the needle to win the championship in college.
It's true.
Like, look how everything has to align, for that to happen. Look how many years Roy Williams was there with lottery pick after lottery pick, and he couldn't win at Kansas either. So,
yeah,
I err on the side of it's a very hard championship to win, and they've had numerous breaks not go their way, but in this game they had a lot go their way.
And I think too, also to that, I think you can add the fact that Kansas obviously recruits really well, but when you talk about a Kentucky or some of these other Duke and whatnot, I don't think there's obviously been a lot of great players that have come through there, but like we said earlier in the show, like you don't have a ton of guys that are just. When you think of Kansas, you think of like the superstars they produced through the years. They produce some really good players. But I think he's done that without having like a Kentucky team that comes in with 5 McDonald's All-Americans and they got a really good chance to make a championship run. I mean, Kansas always has good players, but I think a lot of it's due to coaching in a lot of cases, even more so than the roster, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because a Kansas year may have like an Andrew Wiggins, right? But they don't have on the same team – Karl Anthony Towns, Devin Booker, you know what I mean? Like a litany of guys that are going to be pros, or, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist and Anthony Davis. They don't have like 2 or 3 or 4 lottery picks on the same team. Occasionally they get that really, really blue chip guy, but they normally have a bunch of 4 and 5 stars. Like you said, they're coached up by Self, and before you know it, they're dominating the Big 12 again.
You want a perfect example? Let's fast forward to when these two coaches met again in the championship game when Cal actually won his first championship, that 2012. You look at the roster that Cal had that year, Anthony Davis, Kidd-Gilchrist, Deron Lamb. And on the other side of that, sure, Kansas had a good roster. But when you look through it now, I mean, Tyshawn Taylor, Thomas Robinson, Ben McLemore, who was ineligible that year. He's on that roster. But like you look at that team, like there's not a ton of guys. Like you look at that Kentucky team compared to Kansas roster, it's like night and day compared to like star power.
Yeah, you just named, Robinson and McLemore, you just named 2 of the bigger NBA draft busts in the past 10, 15 years. But good college players. I think that we could have this discussion another time, but I think that I'd put that 2012 Anthony Davis Kentucky team up against any college team I've ever watched.
Yeah, well, because he won Cal's only championship. They have to.
Yeah, but
that
team was great. That team that's one of the only teams I've seen a marquee team buy into defense as much as they buy into offense.
Yeah, that
team was unbelievable. I think they were even better than that Karl Anthony Towns team that almost went undefeated.
So that was their rematch, and these two coaches split championships against each other. Very interesting, but also to point out, we go back through this, and the Memphis Final Four technically never happened because it was all vacated throughout that year. I know you don't really care about that, but just a note to make as we move on from that. But still an incredible season, 38-2 overall for Memphis, with losses to number 2 Tennessee and eventual number 1 Kansas. Those are the only 2 losses all season for them by a combined 2 points in one game and then overtime in the other. So pretty remarkable. That team was just an inch or 2 away from being undefeated that year and winning 40 games. So pretty tough break in a way. It kind of collapsed. Outdated wise, Mike, not a ton. I think one thing that I did notice outdated wise was, we're in an era now where everything's slim fitting for most athletes. Maybe not for you and me all the time, but this was like one of the last few teams where they had baggy shorts. Like Derrick Rose's shorts were below his knees. And now these guys are just like their shorts are like halfway up their thigh. This was like that old era when everything was still baggy and loose. Yeah,
we're in the mid 2000s, man. We're at the end of the mid 2000s with the baggy shorts look. So that was awesome to go back on. I like that look. It's more comfortable.
It is an interesting look. Also, it was funny too seeing Roy Williams with the Kansas sticker on. He was pulling for his team after they lost to him in the semifinals there. But any outdated stuff for you, Mike?
No, Penny Hardaway was in the stands. I think when a lot of people think of Memphis basketball as a whole, they think of Penny Hardaway. And then we have an Alaska basketball update. So if you listen to our episode a couple of weeks ago on the Great Alaska Shootout, we went a lot into Trajan Langdon and Carlos Boozer, how they're both from Alaska and played in the Great Alaska Shootout. Well, this game featured Mario Chalmers, obviously, who is also from Anchorage. So I think, again, we just talked about the holy trinity of big tournament shots. I think maybe the holy trinity of Alaska basketball players are Langdon, Boozer, and Chalmers. And the question remains, how did Mario Chalmers not end up at Duke?
Yeah. I don't know if I ever realized that Chalmers was from Alaska. I probably did at one point, but yeah, that's a great tie back into it. So yeah, great game, Mike. Social media was around, so we don't have to really get into that too much. I think the biggest what ifs for me, and we kind of touched on a little bit there as we went through the game, just, that the fast break where they didn't pull it out with, 20 seconds left and ran more clock, and just kind of a what if they would actually hit their free throws there. At some point down the stretch, things would have been different. Anything else what if wise for you in this game?
I think it gives, you have the NCAA violations that came later. Okay. And I mean, I'll save my opinions on that for the NCAA violation podcast, because I can go on a whole big rant here and I won't. But I think if Memphis wins this game, how many other non-Power 5 schools have won NCAA basketball championships? I can't think of one. I'm sure you'll name one in about 5 seconds here, but
non-Power 5. I think you have to go back a ways to find somebody outside of that group. Yeah, I'm even scrolling back, and Texas Western is probably your last one in 66.
Because they said if Cal won this,
UNLV,
they said by Cal getting to the Final Four, he was the only coach to ever take 2 non-Power 5 schools to the Final Four.
Yeah, I guess UNLV would be your other one back in 1990.
Fair point. Yep.
But yeah, that's a good point. And I don't really think about that because you have so many, basketball's thought of as a sport where everybody has a chance to win it. But when you look at it, it's not completely true. You got, unless you're a Power 5 school, your odds are pretty low to make it all the way through that gauntlet of a NCAA tournament. But this was a classic one, 4-1 seeds getting all the way to the finals. You had Steph Curry in this tournament as well, plus Derrick Rose, Memphis, Kansas, so Chalmers shot. This was a great national championship and a great NCAA tournament. And I kind of missed on our YouTube link, Mike, that we'll put on DistantReplayPodcast.com, that we didn't have one shining moment on the back end of that.
Man, I love one shining moment. But they have these cut-up games where they just show the game.
I know, but it's March Madness's YouTube channel. You think they would add that to the end of the feed?
I know.
Give me that.
It's you know me in my early bedtimes, Ben. That's the only time I'm staying up late is to catch one shining moment at the end of it. Right after they cut down the nets, you have to stay up.
That's tremendous. All right, let's close it out on that note. Thank you for listening to the Distant Replay Podcast. I'm Ben George. He's Mike Noto. Remember, you can find us DistantReplayPodcast.com. We'll have the game up there as well. Plus, all of our games we've gone through are all archived there with the link to watch the full game as it aired originally. Plus, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube as well. Subscribe, rate, review. We would appreciate all that. Thanks for the comments, the feedback that you give us. We take all that into account as well. And we'll have more episodes and more mini-sodes upcoming. So thanks again for listening to this one. This was a lot of fun, Mike.
It sure was. And until next time.